Hey guys, welcome back to UTOP Chess Institute's Buffing Your Black Repertoire. We have another game in the Caro Kann defense for all those Caro Kann lovers out there. So without further ado, let's jump right in. So we have e4, c6, and then knight f3. This is a bit of a rare move, but it's perfectly fine. It just guarantees that you're going to go into one of two different variations. After d5, your opponent can push e5, and after bishop to f5, then they'll play d4, c3, and you'll just get a different move order in the Caro Kann advanced variation short. Or your opponent can play pawn takes, and after we take back with the c pawn, we get the Caro Kann exchange variation. And after d4, then we just continue, and I really like putting the knight on c6 when the c6 square becomes available. I know that that's where my knight wants to go, and so that's where I'm going to put it. My opponent continues with knight to c3. It looks a bit weird, but knight to c3 is actually perfectly fine. So the idea is that he's going to reroute to the king side in the future, or he's going to put pressure via knight to b5, maybe force me to play a move like a6. Also, the knight prevents queen to c7, which is what I normally recommend against the exchange variation, but that's only if they play the move pawn to c3. If here you play queen to c7, obviously your d pawn just hangs, and with tempo, so you're probably going down pretty quickly there. So we just continue with knight to g4. This is much better than knight to f5, and the reason is because we're really fighting for this e5 square. I want to prevent him from putting his knight there, and he's going to try and put his knight there. And so you have to be very careful of the moves h3 and queen to d3, because both of these moves prepare to unpin the knight, and so they both mean that basically we're just going to take the knight, especially after the move bishop to b5. Now this move we have to be extra cautious about. So I continue with e6. He castles, play knight f6, bishop g5, and bishop to e7. And I want to stop here and show you guys why I have so many videos in the Queen's Gambit Declined and the Caro Kann. And the reason is, if you look at the development here, with the bishop on the outside pinning the knight to the queen, the knights on their favorite squares, the c-pawn traded for the e-pawn, and the bishop on e7, and we were to, for example, flip the board and play a Queen's Gambit, declined, exchange variation, just very simple. Let's say he castles here, we play knight here, let's say that he pins it, we move here, and let's say the knight goes to c6. Not a very good move, but let's say that he goes there and we castle. Notice this position is exactly the same as the position that I have in the Caro Kann, only the colors are reversed. So let's go back to our game. Bishop e7. You notice very few pieces changed when I flipped the game. So we go back here and you notice it's exactly the same opening. We're playing a Queen's Gambit Declined exchange variation as black. In other words, we're playing a Carlsbad pawn structure where the c-pawn traded for the e-pawn, and all of our pieces get to their best squares. So black is doing great here. Black has already reached equality, and the ideas between the Queen's Gambit Declined and the ideas in the Caro Kann exchange variation are so interchangeable that if you play these two openings as your repertoire, then you should be incredibly comfortable in these positions. You know the right pawn breaks, you know the right repositioning of your pieces, you know where to attack. For example, we attack on the queen side, and then you feel comfortable. You get to sit in your really comfortable chair, and you get to start to be creative and look for new tactical opportunities. And that's really what I want to do in this video. I want to demonstrate a very comfortable position for us and how we can go about looking for fun and creative tactical and winning chances. So after bishop to e7, my opponent plays rook to e1, putting the rook on the half-open file and x-raying my king. Whenever I see an x-ray, I always try and get out of it because it just creates so many tactical opportunities in the future. For example, bishop takes, and knight takes. Obviously, it doesn't work right now because the queen guards, but that is just one thing that white is brewing. So let's castle. None of those shenanigans. And now my opponent plays bishop takes c6. And the reason is because we're threatening now after we castle. Bishop takes knight, queen takes, and then knight takes d4, which forks the queen and the bishop. So we don't even lose the bishop pair. We simply trade a pair of bishops, a pair of knights, and we win a pawn. Obviously, if after bishop takes, pawn takes, then his pawn structure gets damaged and this pawn is still weak. So both those variations are bad for white, and that's why he decides to take here. We take back, and now queen d3. And remember what I said about the knight landing here? Super annoying. This bishop, I think, is already done its job. Let's get rid of that knight. Queen takes, and now the bishop gained a tempo because the queen moved and then retook and is on f3, which I don't think is a particularly good square. I played rook to b8, which puts the rook on the half-open file and attacks the weak b2 pawn. He plays rook to b1, and I like this because now you'll see we'll get some tactical opportunities. This knight gets a little bit more vulnerable. This becomes a potential pin if the rook moves. This pawn is weak, and this pawn is weak. Also, this pawn is no longer defended if the knight moves to create a pawn chain, which is kind of necessary for white. This knight needs to reroute to get to a better square. So I play queen to c7, just improving my queen and sort of baiting this bishop move so that we can trade off the bishops. He took my knight, however, and I want to talk about this move for a second. Obviously, we take back with the bishop, but here his idea is that if we trade all the rooks and all the queens, then he's going to play into a bishop versus knight endgame, which would give him probably decent winning chances. It's a nice imbalance, and I personally like playing with the knight against the bishop. However, he did it way too soon, right? There's way too much material on the board, and my bishop is way too active on this diagonal and doing a really nice job defending my king. I can always play g6, bishop g7 if the opportunity arises. For example, after like queen here and maybe the knight reroutes this way. And now this pawn is getting pretty weak, and I don't think that he had to basically commit to such a committal move so early. So yeah, takes, and now he played knight to e2. And I pushed the move c5. Now is really the time we want to crack at his structure, because after the move c3, we take, he takes, and now he ends up with an isolated pawn. I always tell my students that at the beginning of this exchange, if you realize no matter what you play, for example, if knight takes, bishop takes, pawn takes, no matter what you play, you're going to end up with an isolated pawn, then you might as well start with taking by the pawn. That way you leave material on the board and you have plenty of drawing or winning chances. If you take with the knight here, now I think black is in the driver's seat. The rook and queen endgame will just be much easier for black to play, target all of these weaknesses, and eventually I think they'll fall and black should be able to convert it into a win. So pawn takes was definitely the correct choice. But now, like I said, we are so familiar with these positions that we can always look for creative opportunities. And I'm going to pause here, and I suggest you pause your video for as long as it takes, but I want you to find a game-winning tactic here for black. So it looks like kind of a drawish position, but we have a tactic, or we set up a tactic that should win material and enough to win the game, or give us a winning position in the game. Pause your video if you haven't found it yet, or take your time, because it's really important we find moves like this, because they happen all the time in our games and they're hard to spot, but once we spot them, it's just crushing. And that move is queen to a5, and really white can't stop losing material here. because we're attacking a2, but we're also putting pressure on e1, which means this rook is overloaded defending the pawn and the rook. So after pawn to a3, we smash him with rook takes b2. Obviously, rook takes would be a huge blunder because he just gets back rank mated. So there isn't much better for him to do than just play rook b to d1. And now I bring the second rook over, and yeah, we're already double stacked on the b file, and we're just threatening rook to b3, and we're going to win the a pawn. So he makes some luft, which is pretty smart. Rook b3. Now queen f4, and he's using my idea back at me. And the idea is that if I take with the rook, then we're probably going to get back rank mated. Or at least we're going to end up trading queens. I'm going to be down a rook. So we have to take with the queen. Now he goes rook here, and he's basically saying, take my rook, because then I'll take yours with check, and you'll probably get mated. No, my queen can guard on f8, but still terrible variation. So this rook is kind of pinned. So let's move the queen, and let's move the queen back to a5. I like this because now we have the threat of queen takes rook. So he moves his king over to defend, and instead of letting up on the gas here, let's go all the way in. So rook to b1, and now he really needs to play the d rook back to d1 and cover his back rank, because we have a lot of pressure here. That's not what I meant to do. The queen and the rook both targeting e1, but instead he takes, and I take with check, and the king goes here. I also want to pause for a second here because I remember back in the days when I was a 1500, I would be so happy with my position here. I played an awesome opening, I played an awesome middle game, and I would play a move like queen to d8. And I would just say, yes, I have a winning position, so I'll just guard my back rank and he can't do anything. And as soon as you play a move like queen to d8, you're signaling to your opponent, my attack is done. My hands are off the trigger, and I'm just gonna chill and wait for you to self-destruct. And a good enough player, especially like this opponent who has clever ideas, tricks, and traps, and he's not going to go down without a fight, he's going to realize, all right, it's time to make a plan, and it's time to strike back. And I've lost, when I was 15, 1600, I lost numerous games so frustratingly for doing exactly that. But then when I started to improve, and it went through looking at a lot of Grandmaster games, and it's that the Grandmasters will just focus on key squares. And they realize that the queen's infiltration, which is the only piece that can really attack me, is on b8. And b8 is guarded, which means queen to d8 does absolutely nothing. There's no reason to guard all of these squares because the only one that matters is b8. And since we already have that guarded, then it's time to look for continuing to attack. The more pressure we can put our opponent, the faster he'll collapse. And we do that with queen to e1. Now our pieces are just infiltrating, and white is gonna fall apart really fast. If I was white in this position, I would be like, oh, it's over. So my opponent plays king to f3. Obviously these checks were incredibly annoying, but I think he should have left his king here. And after a move like queen to h1 check, he goes here, and at least he won't lose his h-pawn. But he plays king to f3. Kind of looks logical. He has to defend the knight, so yeah, what are you going to do? So now I played this really cute move h6. And my idea is that I'll have moves like g5, bishop g5, which both attack the queen and maybe will allow checks in the future, or forks on something. And most importantly, we create some luft for our king. And lastly, I don't see any plans for my opponent. I don't see any moves that do anything. And so sometimes it's best to make a simple improving moves, hand the microphone back to your opponent and ask them, like, what are you doing in this position? And immediately my opponent blunders and plays rook to e3. And so we play bishop to g5, skewering the queen and the rook. The queen moves to e5. We take, queen takes, and now queen h1 check. The king moves here, and we take the pawn. He starts to move his pawns, which I guess makes sense, but probably a move like rook to e1 would be really strong. But I decided it's time to get my queen around and try and look for a queen trade. So I want to play queen to g5 and just win the queen or at least trade queens. My opponent obliges with the move g4. We check and he resigned here, but let's look why. If he goes here, we'll take. The knights are under attack and there are no really good squares, so let's say the knight goes here. We give the check. He could go here. We could go check here and then mate. So it was mate in 4 after we won the queen. And yeah, just proves that the game is so much more fun and you win a lot faster if when you get into these winning positions. Let's go all the way back to, I think, this position. Yeah, this position. Don't retreat. Don't retreat your queen. Look for ways to infiltrate and continue the attack. And I guarantee that you will find the game much more exhilarating. You'll find your wins much easier, and you'll find your opponents put up a lot less resistance. A move like queen to d8 is something that I definitely would have played a year ago, and I'm so glad that I look for better moves now. So hopefully you guys found that educational, and yeah, I'll catch you next time. Take care. Bye.